Good is whatever promotes life. Evil is whatever destroys it.
From
From there,
there, you
you
make
make
your
your
own
own
decisions.
decisions.
Welcome to the Indiana Jones universe, the podcast that explores the incredible adventures of the world's greatest globe-trotting archaeologist, Indiana Jones. Each episode is a casual and somewhat humorous, opinionated conversation with a slightly sophisticated analytical study of the expanded universe content from the Indiana Jones franchise. You can expect to find discussions about the adventures of young Indiana Jones, the further adventures of Indiana Jones comic books, the Staff of Kings and Emperor's Tomb video games, the Indiana Jones novels, the original soundtracks, and so much more. Hello, everybody, and welcome back to another episode of the Indiana Jones Universe podcast. Thanks so much for joining us. And today we are very excited to introduce our first ever interview series here on the podcast. For a long time now, one thing we've wanted to do is collaborate with numerous special guests on this show, including some of the talented individuals who have been a part of the expanded universe of Indiana Jones over the years. So with that said, we're thrilled to begin today what is part one of our 30th anniversary retrospective for the Young Indiana Jones Chronicles, where we're going to be interviewing some of the talented filmmakers who worked on this series. So I'm extremely honored to be introducing our very first special guest today. This talented gentleman is a renowned Australian filmmaker. He has directed such feature films as The Light Horseman, Quigley Down Under, as well as the famous miniseries Lonesome Dove. And he also directed several episodes of this television series called The Young Indiana Jones Chronicles. Not sure if you've ever heard of it, but ladies and gentlemen, please welcome our very special guest today, Mr. Simon Wincer.
Oh, thank you very much for having me, gentlemen. The thing that I loved about this series was that it was a very special part of my life because as a filmmaker, we got to work in the most remote parts of the world to bring this series to the screen, and the group of people that George Lucas assembled for this series is quite remarkable when you look at the backgrounds and where people have gone even since we made that series.
Dang, yeah. I'm really looking forward to hearing all these stories. But let's get started. So maybe tell us a little bit about yourself. How did your film career begin, and how did that ultimately lead to your role on the Young Indiana Jones Chronicles?
My career began as a mailboy at an Australian ABC television, and I sort of basically television was in its very early years, and uh, I worked my way up the ladder from mailboy to studio hand to floor manager to cameraman, and then got to direct little, you know, broadcasts like the weather and the news, and that's where it all started. And then I worked because I was interested in directing drama. I worked in the theatre for quite some years, and which took me to London. And then at the start of his career was a young director called Ridley Scott, and he had come out of the art department of this company, Rediffusion Television, and this was even before his commercial career, which happened even after that. But and so eventually I got my chance to direct when I came back to Australia with a local production company that made a lot of police dramas, and off I went and made a couple of low budget feature films. And to cut a long story short, I think it was probably after I directed Lonesome Dove, which I was lucky enough to be chosen for because every director in America wanted to direct that. That sort of probably led me to Young Indiana Jones.
talking about the way George Lucas gathered all these people together, what were your like your personal initial conversations like with George Lucas and Rick McCallum, and like how well did your creative vision align with their ideas?
Well, it's very interesting you asked that question because I had just finished a movie called Harley Davidson and the Marlboro Man. We'd finished the final mix on a Friday night, and Saturday morning at my hotel in Los Angeles, I got a fax from Rick McCallum saying would I be interested in directing an episode of a 2-hour episode of Young Indiana Jones set in Africa, but they needed an immediate answer. Well, it so happened I'd finished work the day before and was readily available. So I received the script later that day and read it, loved it. It was the Oganga story, and flew to London, would you believe, on the Concorde, and quickly was briefed and given a lot of injections. And literally a day later, I was on a plane to Nairobi in Africa, and away we went. It wasn't until we actually started filming that I got to meet George, because they were shooting another episode in Spain. And by the time we'd finished casting and doing the location scout, the rest of the lot arrived from Spain, and I got to meet George and Rick McCallum. And one of my very, very early conversations with George was we sat down to lunch one day on location, and he and Rick had a list of all these planned episodes that they were going to shoot. And there was a gap, and it was October 1917. I said to George, have you seen my film, The Light Horseman? And he said, yes, I love that movie. And I
Wow.
said, well, the charge at Beersheba, which is that film was about, was the last cavalry charge, successful cavalry charge in history. It took place on October the 31st, 1917. So George wrote in his list of scripts, Palestine, 1917, charge at Beersheba. And that was the beginning of what became Daredevils of the Desert.
And one thing that's very interesting as well, you speak about George Lucas, is, his concept for this series was very different because he wanted to kind of use it as a teaching tool to educate students about historical events. So, for you as a director, was it kind of challenging to differentiate this series so heavily from the Indiana Jones films?
No, not really, because I think we all just loved the idea of the concept. And George said to me, he just hated the fact that his kids were growing up not knowing about all these fantastic, events and characters in history. And this was a great device to sort of educate, the children, of America and the world. And I think we all fully supported that, because most of us are parents, and we just thought, wow, what an interesting way of teaching history.
I would have loved to have these episodes in school when I guess Will and I were growing up, because that would have been a really fun way to learn. Continuing with George Lucas here, this was a TV series that experimented, with a lot of new digital filmmaking techniques. So, as a director, what challenges and benefits came from taking this approach?
One of the major things that made this series appear so epic was the fact that George decided and convinced the network to shoot the series on 16 mil, which is probably costs about half the price at 35 mil. And, there are enormous savings there. And so that allowed, shoot always with multiple cameras, and you're not quite as responsible with the amount of film stock you're shooting, because it's 16 mil, which is probably half the price. And those savings allowed us enormous production values. It was nice to be able to, doing a battle scene, for example, to be able to shoot with 3 and 4 cameras as opposed to, a single camera, and not have to worry so much about the amount of film stock. And so when the series was turned into, 2-hour movies, the quality is remarkable. And that's all the result of this great sort of digital technology, to look like 35 and then beautiful quality digital pictures.
George Lucas, he had this unconventional approach, of course, of hiring different directors for every episode. So, how did like your responsibilities change compared to other previous projects you'd worked on, like your movies?
He was very easy to work with, but I, in fact, was chosen at the last minute to direct this first episode I did, because a previous director, he had not liked the way he'd covered scenes, and and so he loved the way that I worked, and everything shot on multiple cameras with lots of coverage, and because his background originally, of course, is editing, and he loved everything to be really well covered, traditional a master shot, and then going for the coverage of the medium shots and the close-ups and the inserts and stuff like that, the pace and the length and so forth, and very difficult when directors love doing scenes in one single shot, which doesn't mean they're not justified, but uh, you do need to, particularly in television, you need to have absolute control over the running time and the pace and the energy and so forth. And it all gets down to the story and telling the story and the best way of telling it.
Yeah, and that's a great point because I think what this show was able to do so well is really kind of expand the boundaries for TV, which was unheard of back then. And another thing I'm curious to know a little bit more about is your collaboration with Sean Patrick Flannery. There obviously were two actors who played Indy in this show, and you only worked with him on all of your episodes. And were there any specific sort of Indiana Jones characteristics that you wanted him to sort of incorporate into each episode to emulate the style of Harrison Ford in any way?
Look, most of that was already established when I came on board because they'd already shot in Egypt and Spain. And so they'd done a couple of episodes. And so that was pretty much firmly established. Um, so it was more a case of he'd really sort of nailed what we thought was the appropriate body language and stuff in the very early episodes.
You were kind of talking about how the way you were chosen was, the way you do your filmmaking, and I was kind of wondering, Indiana Jones has this very distinct visual tone. So, like, what kind of things did you pay attention to as a director to fit into that tone? And does that, ever conflict with your personal style, or did it kind of fit right in?
One of my favorite movies is Lawrence of Arabia, and I love the epic nature of that film and the epic landscapes. And so I think you can probably, see in my episodes that they're all pretty epic. And I just love that large canvas and a magnificent color palette. And so big battle scene, in Africa, and my second unit director, one of the world's great editors and sound editors, was Ben Burt. It was a privilege not only to meet Ben, but to work with him. And what a delightful human being he is, an absolute lover of the film medium. So I suppose my epic style is also reflected in Lonesome Dove, which George had loved and Rick had loved, and so it probably all stems from that.
Yeah, I love to hear that because I think people hear Ben's work every day now. He has quite the legacy. But let's talk about that first two-part episode you worked on, Oganga. Frank Darabont, he wrote these episodes, but it's your job to turn what's on paper into a great film. So I'd say, how much of a film's success comes from the script?
Oh, that's where it starts and ends. It's all about the screenplay, and don't let anyone ever tell you otherwise. It is all about what's on paper. And look, a bad script, it's very hard to trick it up to make it acceptable. It all gets back to what's on paper. It's simple as that. And to start with a script by Frank Darabont, who in those days was totally unknown. But gee, what was on paper was great. Some wonderful scenes. I know the scripts, that group of writers on Indie, they were all heavily workshopped the scripts for weeks.
Yeah, and I mean, it sounds like the collaboration on this show was just tremendous. I mean, the amount of sort of hard work that went into this, and just the creative vision was, I think, so distinct, which is fabulous to hear. And now, this episode in particular is fascinating to me because it kind of deals with Indy oscillating between these two ideologies, right? He's has this duty as a soldier, but then he also learns a little bit about reverence for life in the episode, and you kind of show this with a little bit of a juxtaposition, I think, with this big battle sequence, the Battle of Tabora at the beginning, and then you end off, with the Schweitzer portion on the DVD format. And so I'm curious, how did you go about emphasizing this philosophy so well?
At first, it goes back to what was already, in the script on paper by Frank. The most important thing, of course, after that is the casting, and we had a wonderful group of French actors, and so Frederick von Curie played Albert Schweitzer, who was remarkable, and the casting ladies, Lucy Bolting and Annie McKee, they did a brilliant job. Every episode they were sort of having to find actors from different parts of the world who could create our stories. And so from that point of view, in a way, a director has to have reverence for script, if I might
Yeah.
take those words from Albert Schweitzer. And because many years ago, when I was a young director, a very well-known actor said to me, it's very easy for an actor to change the words that are in the script, but what you have to understand is that those speeches have been fought over and pared down, and it's our job to try and make them work before we change them to suit ourselves. And I think that's very true. I've always had enormous respect for what's on paper and always try and make something work, as it's written. And if an actor wants to change something, then it only will ever happen with me if it actually makes what you're doing better, and that's basically what you rehearse for.
You kind of talked about, how it was like being on location in Africa, and this was filmed in quite a remote part of Kenya. So, this footage of Indy and the rest of the company traversing Africa, it's like full of so much artistry, and in some ways, it really reminds me of Jack Ford and his style of filmmaking, out there, which is, I guess, why George Lucas kind of picked you for this. What was it like filming this episode in this wilderness environment?
Funnily enough, I had to make a speech at a function yesterday, and I talked a bit about young Indiana Jones and said,
Oh, wow.
there we were at what was a bird watching camp up in the northeastern part of Kenya, right on the Somalian border, on the estuary where the Tana River goes into the Indian Ocean, and living under canvas, and every morning after breakfast, being picked up by boat at 6:30 in the morning and transported upriver and then overland across to the set where Albert Schweitzer's compound was. And look, we're journeying past hippopotamus and all these beautiful birds and wildlife, and what a privilege. And everybody just loved it. It was quite fantastic. Let me tell a story about my very first day's filming. Which we had there's this period steamboat where the guys who were traveling these rifles across Africa from the west coast to the east coast down the Congo River. And so our first day's filming was on this little great looking period steamboat, that's got a cannon mounted on the bow. And here they are chuffing down the river. And because it was my first day's filming, working for George Lucas and Steven Spielberg, I really wanted to impress. But it was hard to go wrong with these fantastic backgrounds. And we were doing the scenes where the soldiers are all in the boat, and one by one they're falling off the perch with malaria and getting worse and worse and worse until eventually the boat is just drifting along, with everybody literally passed out. Anyway, so the first day's filming, we're on this little great looking boat, and lots of people, cameras, lights, wardrobe, makeup, da. And we filmed all day long, great scenes, really happy with what we're getting. But it was challenging on this little boat with all these people. And, the river we're on, there's lots of crocodiles on the banks and stuff like that. Anyway, last shot of the day is just a shot of the boat with the soldiers by now have all succumbed to disease, have passed out, and the boat's just drifting lazily down the river. Well, my God, the unforeseen happened. This boat started to tip over, and it tipped over with over a dozen cast and extras on board. And I was in a little camera boat with David Tattersall, the DP, and we raced over and rescued Sean and Remy, while the others swam for shore, breaking the world water speed record. So, end of my first day's filming, day one day behind schedule. Oh my God, what a start, But anyway, so we had to get another boat and build it and make it a little bit safer, and was probably more practical for our needs, but pretty dangerous with crocodiles infest all these rivers
Oh
and
my
so
goodness.
forth.
Do you have any other stories of like weird disasters that happened like that?
Every day, the life of a filmmaker is full of ups and downs,
Uh-huh.
but that's what makes it, it's, but that was probably the worst thing that happened on that episode. Look, Gavin Bakay, the production designer, had done a brilliant job, and Albert Schweitzer's set compound was just terrific, in the middle of nowhere, and with a great team. Rick McCallum was a great leader and loved by everybody. David Barron, who was sort of the executive in charge of production, he went on to produce most of the Harry Potter movies. For example, our second assistant director, Callum McDougall, he went on to produce some of the Bond movies and so forth. So the depth of people was fantastic. A great DP and camera crew, David Tattersall, and who was just delightful to work with and very talented. And costume designers and so forth. It was a great group of people, And then, in post-production, you got people like, Ben Bird, of course, and Louise Rebecca, who just cut Godfather 3. She cut Oganga, and it's an amazing team of people.
Yeah, I was wondering because I know you have a lot of memories from this time period. How long were you with all these people that you got to work with?
Well, I was lucky because I ended up doing 6 episodes, and I did 2 2-hour ones, and then I did Petrograd and what was originally Palestine, which was then expanded into 2 hours. But I got to know all these people really well, and just a terrific group. And everywhere we went, whether it was Russia or Africa or Czechoslovakia, we picked up locals as well, and they were all terrific.
All your episodes feature these really strong side characters, and in this episode specifically, we have Sergeant Bartlemy, Major Boucher, and these two characters, they hold these opposing philosophies. With the series being so heavily focused on Indy, how do you get the audience invested in these other characters?
Immediately adore this guy because he's the one that rescues this little boy that's been left to die, and he talks quite openly about life and what his beliefs are, and you can see Indri's in a way is conflicted by what his responsibilities are. He understands the way the military works, but on the other hand, has these emotions, and I think that's probably the strength of the episode.
Now let's talk about Albert Schweitzer. He's such a profound character. So, how did you work with the actor to bring him as a character to life?
Wonderful actor called Frederick von Turen. And in fact, on my trip from London to Africa, I actually, the casting department arranged for me to stop in en route and meet Frederick, who came to the airport. And while we were waiting for my next flight, we had a cup of coffee and a chat together. And I was really impressed with him. He spoke impeccable English, and so we hit it off from a meeting at Munich Airport, and he arrived beautifully prepared. One of the things that Frank had suggested, because he knew that Schweitzer was a great lover of Bach, and but I came up with the idea of Jesu, Joy of Man's Desire, which is probably the
Wow.
most well-known piece of Bach, and I guess everybody in the world almost has heard that somewhere. So happened that Frederick could also play the piano, which is a great help, so we didn't have to fake too much of that. We were both on the same page as far as the character was concerned, and he'd done, quite a lot of research and certainly knew a lot more about him than I did with my limited research with the time I had amount available. But I think he was really so solid, and the 2 scenes where he's traveling with Indy on the river on the boat, and he talks about the reverence of life and how the thinking man gives every life the same reverence that he gives his own. Good is whatever promotes life. This is wonderful stuff that Frank had written and beautifully delivered and played by Frederick. The way we had to shoot those scenes, because we couldn't have the engine of the boat going, and we literally had to go up river and let it, give it a good tow, and then
Wow.
the towing boat would bail out, and we'd just drift down the river with the beautiful jungle background, and these days those scenes would be shot on a stage in front of a green screen, but none of that was. It's all for real, and having such a wonderful actor as Frederick made that so possible. And also Sean's reactions in that scene are really terrific. You can really see,
Yeah.
he's caught by everything that Albert Schweitzer is saying to him. And he's because he's a soldier and he's conflicted, but it's all wonderful the way it's sinking. And I think Sean played those scenes really well.
Oh, I absolutely agree. I love Sean Patrick Flannery in this episode because we know Indy is such a heroic figure, and to see him undergo so much transformation, I think, is one of the reasons I like this show because it does something different that you haven't seen before, and the dialogue is so profound that to capture that is also, I think, a really difficult thing, and it was so well done in this episode. Now another thing I'm curious a little bit about is in most of your episodes the character of Remy was a large part of Indy's adventures, and what did you think was important about their friendship, and what was it like working with the actor, Ronnie Couture?
Ronnie was an absolute darling of a person. I think it pretty much what's on screen is the real Ronnie, and great fun and always laugh, and physically a bit challenged because he's a big man, but never complained and was always up for it. And I'll never forget the trouble David and Tatsu and I had dragging him into our camera boat. Sean literally scrambled in. Ronnie was a big man. Oh my God, we struggled, David and I, and thinking, oh God, don't let a crocodile grab his foot. But no, Ronnie was a darling and very well prepared. Look, occasionally I'd have to pick him up, say, look, slow it down and give him a bit of a guide on pronunciation. But no, it was always good working with Ronnie.
Now, we touched on this a little bit earlier, but one of the things that I think is great in addition to the dialogue here is the music of this episode, and you very well, illustrated Schweitzer as a Bach scholar. You touched on this a little bit earlier, but in what ways were you involved with the soundtrack for this episode, and what did you think was important about it?
Joel McNeely did a beautiful job, and with the Munich Symphony Orchestra. Hello, normally the director's very involved in the score, but in this case, because I went on to do other episodes, all that was sort of happening in California, and I was thrilled with the music. In fact, the overall post production of the series is quite, I think, remarkable. Behind from sound mixers like Gary Summers is been at Skyworker for years and done all those massive movies, and Ben Burt and Louise, who I mentioned, and it just, it all gets done. But so the choice of music, I can't say that I was involved in music, although of course I chose Jesu Joy of Man's Desire, which was so wonderful to use in that montage with Albert Schweitzer, at work around his hospital with all the Africans that were coming in, to see him with their children and so forth.
Yeah, I think that was a really amazing choice on your end because that's like one of the most moving scenes for me in the entire episode. I think that music perfectly encapsulates what's happening on screen there. And I gotta say, for me, this is probably the most thought-provoking episode in the entire series. And every time I watch it, I'm reminded of these profound questions that Frank Darabont wrote in here, but it's the real Albert Schweitzer, and it really makes me think about how much our society values life. And I guess basically, I'd just like to say thank you to you and the entire team for creating such a deeply thoughtful and artistic film.
Oh, thank you. Look, I really appreciate that. I must admit, when I watched it last week downstairs from my little office studio and said to my wife, my God, I can't, I didn't realize, how wonderful that episode was. And I'm very, very proud of that episode, probably of all the ones I did. And when the episode went to air in America, George Lucas received a most wonderful letter, which was copied to me from Albert Schweitzer's daughter.
Wow.
And basically a beautifully written letter, how impressed she was with the portrayal of her father and how right it was and how real it was and how she was so moved. For a filmmaker, that sort of, if you like, a praise is quite unusual and quite rare. And to come from somebody like her, it was just remarkable. And George and I were truly very moved by what she had to say and realized that, wow, this episode really truthful in its portrayal of such an important character in world history. It was just an experience that every filmmaker dreams about.
I mean, that's amazing. And, it's unfortunate that the show didn't do so well, on ABC, but to get that affiliation that you captured this moment so well from somebody like Albert Schweitzer's daughter, that's incredible. So thanks so much for sharing that. With that said, let's move on to another episode you worked on, the next one, which was in season 2 of the original airing of the show, which is now known as Trenches of Hell. And, the first thing I have to ask is the Battle of the Somme, for anyone who's a big history buff, is such a poignant topic to be covering on television. And how did you approach recreating this monumental battle, through the lens of a fictitious character like Indy?
I guess I wanted to first of all show, the epic nature of this terrible battle where millions died, and it dragged on for months and months and months. And so it's interesting to be able to put Indy in amongst all that and portray a little bit of the character that we know from the movies, the heroics. George and I talked about, and this episode was written by a wonderful writer called Jonathan Hensley. I was actually sitting in the editing room at Skywalker Ranch, and the phone rang. It was a lady called Beth Sullivan, and she had just was looking for a director to do a pilot for a series called Dr. Quinn Medicine Woman. Anyway, George was sitting by my side, and he obviously overheard a bit of the conversation. He's going, stop, 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 waving his hands and all this sort of stuff. And I said, "Oh, Beth, can I call you back?" And she said, "Yeah, sure." Hung up, and George said, "Oh, look, I forgot to offer you the next 2-hour episode of Young Indy. It's going to be All Quiet on the Western Front and The Great Escape, all rolled into a 2-hour movie. But I heard you about to take something else, and I knew that would make you unavailable." When George or Lucas asked you to do something, I was very, very flattered, and because we didn't know each other that well at that stage, because I'd just done the one African episode, which was so. Of course, if I'd done Dr. Quinn, I would have made a bloody fortune because the series went on to being incredibly successful. However, I was lucky enough to do the Trenches of Hell episode, and so that's how that sort of came about. To work with him in the editing room was fantastic because people think of George as a technical guy, and that everything's about the technique and the this and the that. And he's quite the opposite. It's all about character and story. I'd say to George, "You can't do that. That's a terrible cut." He said, "Doesn't matter. It's better for the story."
Wow.
And I learned so much from him, and I'd asked him what is his key to directing. And he said to me quite simply, he said, "The most important thing for a director is to know when to compromise and when not to compromise." In other words, if you're shooting a scene that's not that important and you can get away with it being, in one shot or whatever, then do it, just to keep everyone happy and on schedule. But he said, if it's a really key important scene, don't give an inch, fight for it. You've got to do it. Doesn't matter if it goes half a day over, because that's the key to the movie. And so I thought those words of advice, knowing when to compromise and when not to compromise, and I've lived by that adage ever since.
Yeah, I think that really allows you to get those awesome scenes that stick in your memory, when Albert Schweitzer was treating all those children at his compound. But this episode, back to this one, I think it won an award or two for the sound, right?
Ben Burt edited the first hour, which was the Trenches of Hell. We call it the All Quiet on the Western Front. When I went up to see the rough cut, Ben had literally done a Dolby stereo mix, and I sat in the
Wow.
theater at Skywalker and was blown away by the bombs and missiles going over our heads and coming from all around the theater. It was
That is
unbelievable.
amazing.
When we showed it to George the next day after we'd made, a few little adjustments here and there and so forth, George too was blown away because Ben is the most extraordinary, editor and sound guy. There is no better sound person in the world than Ben Burt. And then on top of that, Frederick Talgor, this French composer, did a stunning score.
Oh,
My
yeah.
God, the characters in the movie, Siegfried Sassoon and Robert Graves, just fantastic characters, and Charles de Gaulle, fantastic. I had a wonderful stunt coordinator who's probably still the top of the tree, called Simon Crane, and his staging of, could shoot for, the Somme battle scenes were just stunning, great group of stunties as well. But again, it all gets back to the team, and the planning, and a lot of fun shooting that. We built this huge area at the back of Barandov Studios in Prague, where we created the battlefield of the Somme, and we had Russian trench builders who actually built the trenches and the
Wow.
tunnels and stuff, and they did a great job. It was a very, very exciting episode to work on, and again, dozens and dozens and dozens of extras, because you're not having to worry about, are there enough people in the shop.
Well, that's a terrific story, and thanks for sharing it. Because one of the things that I think is so interesting, and you talked about Skywalker Ranch like that, is as a director, I would assume your perspective of the episode changes after you hear the music and the sound effects, which in this episode, like, so perfectly acquaint the audience with the horrors of warfare. And to me, I think one of the best aspects of this episode, as you touched on a little bit, is the music of Frederick Talgorn. Did you have any sort of relationship that you developed with him, or any sort of influence on that score?
No, look, I can't claim credit for that. I wish I could, but he just latched onto it. And I think he'd obviously studied a lot of John Williams, work in the Indiana Jones films and stuff. So none of the music feels out of place.
I have to say, back to what you were talking about with those trench diggers, it's really funny that like that's a real profession you could have, because the set design for this episode is meticulous, and particularly those trenches. So I guess how important was the cinematography and that production design for creating this specific environment and recreating that time period and that moment?
I don't even know how many days we filmed those trench scenes, but they all went remarkably smoothly. And we got a week of pretty good weather, because we were filming in winter, and we didn't get so much rain. It was fiercely cold. And the way we laid out trenches on the back lot was so that basically the sun would be behind them, and backlight always helps with the smoke and the effects and stuff like that. Designed by Gavin Bouquet, and in fact, my wife was actually the art director one of the art
Oh,
directors on
wow.
that particular episode. Which at that stage we weren't even married, but she was an art director, and she only came for a holiday, and 2 days later they had her working in the art department. But no, look, it was great, and also, the Czech assistant directors as well, because obviously none of the extras could speak English, so that's always challenging. But interpreters and stuff to explain what you want, and Simon Crane too. We all had interpreters that would help, and always challenging, but we always managed to somehow get it done.
This episode is quite, gripping and ferocious, and I think a very sort of unique way. And there's one scene that I think is absolutely terrific that I'd love to talk about. When Indy, watches one of his fellow soldiers die right in front of him from poison gas, he loses his mask. And then it simultaneously creates this thick fog over the advancing flamethrowers over the trenches, which is so horrifying. And, as a director, how do you create such a strong sense of fear for the audience in a scene like this?
Well, in a way, the pictures do it for you. And it was relatively still and there was no wind. So by using a few fans, we could sort of blow all that supposed gas, over the trenches after that initial attack. And then to see through this sort of mist and fog, that I think they're pretty horrifying images. And again, you only need to show a couple of close-ups of soldiers and fear, through on their eyes through these masks that they're wearing, and you're there. I think amazing score and sound effects as well. So I was dreading doing that, because setting people on fire too is another very, very dangerous thing. But luckily that Simon Crane and his team were all totally prepared and all organized, and it happened pretty smoothly.
Right. And on the contrary, one of the things I love about this episode is the like huge juxtaposition they create after that scene when Indy and the rest of his company are given this 2-day leave, and the tone and pacing of the episode shifts so dramatically all of a sudden. And this is when Indy gets the chance to meet Robert Graves and Siegfried Sassoon. And I love the scene when he reads aloud one of his poems that he wrote, called Dreamers. And as Indy reads it, multiple scenes of them all together in the Battle of the Somme fade over the screen. Was that something you had requested to do in post production?
That was pretty much my idea. The whole thing, the words of the
Oh, that's great.
of the poem "Dreamers" sort of led to that. I can't remember it being scripted, but again, beautiful script by Jonathan Hensley and fascinating characters.
Yeah. One of the characters I really enjoyed was Lieutenant Moreau, and his death is actually kind of hard for me to watch because it's so terrible and poignant. As a spectator, you almost see it coming. He's like, this is the one moment where he lets his guard down, he takes off his helmet, and he's talking about the good things in life, like, his wife and back home, and then he just is killed in a moment. And I feel like, how do you create that sense of premonition for the audience when you don't actually see the threat?
I think it's a combination of I suppose, how you shoot it in a way, and it's the last thing you'd expect because it's sort of quiet, and he and India are off to the side, if you like, and seem to be in a relatively safe position.
Yeah, another great scene in this episode is the tunnel sequence when they have to travel, through the trenches up to the chateau. And it's extremely suspenseful, but also incorporates this element of surprise. And as a filmmaker, I mean, what are the specific things and techniques that you specifically look for in creating that type of suspense and surprise, and perhaps differentiating the two in some ways?
First of all, I guess you have to create the sense of danger. They've made an incredible effort just to get to that tunnel, under machine gun fire as they race from one trench across that open area and literally absolutely dive for safety, for cover. And then again, as they start to move down the tunnel, the odd ricochet, and then, set up the fact that there's a soldier lying in wait, and by God, there's no way they're going to be able to get past him because, but then Indy comes up with the idea of being able to slide up the wall where he's just out of the view of that soldier, so that when he puts his gun round the corner, Indy can grab it and literally overcome him. And again, a lot of the suspense is just created in coverage and the editing and the music and the sound, and it's a combination of all those factors, really.
Now, one very interesting sort of behind the scenes fact that I'd love to share with you, and curious if you know a little bit about it, is in Australia, ironically enough, both the Somme and Germany episodes, when they were split apart, actually aired as a complete 2 hour movie in 1993 before they ever developed the DVD release, and it was titled Young Indiana Jones and the Great Escape. Very rare sort of airing in Australia. Was this sort of a title to an homage, of course, to the film The Great Escape as inspiration for the tunnel dig scene? And did you know about that?
I didn't know about that particular screening. No, I had no idea. But there is a bit of footage from All Quiet on the Western Front, but that sort of stuff mostly happened back at Skywalker. But it was always a 2 hour episode to me. Part one is All Quiet on the Western Front. Part two is The Great Escape, and because even when old Indy was at the head of every episode, I never ever saw those bits because they were all sort of done later and integrated. So for me, it makes sense that those two episodes were, shown as one because they certainly both blend together beautifully, and that's pretty much how Jonathan designed it in the script. There must have been a long-term plan, and the same with Oganga. That was pretty much the same. That was always a 2 hour episode.
Well, let's talk a little bit about this final scene here, which is one of my all-time favorite moments from the series, I must say. And this is when Indy and Charles de Gaulle, of course, are escaping after they, get out and hide in the coffins. And Indy finds this bike and barely escapes this German soldier on this motorcycle by passing this oncoming train. And what's really brilliant about it is, I think you captured Indy's anticipation very well because you made the audience realize what he was going to do before the moment even happened. And if you could take us through your sort of creative vision for this scene, how did you create this grand finale for this episode?
Yeah, actually, no trickery, just very carefully worked out by Simon Crane and his stunt team. They ran the train first on its own and with a stopwatch, and made sure that how fast he could do it on his own, and where he'd need to start and so forth. And it was important that I did a couple of tie-in shots where you saw Sean and the train, together in one shot. Set it up so that you realize what was going to happen before it happened, because it was, it was close, but it was very carefully worked out by the stunt team. And what I wanted to do in that chase beforehand was to create a good old fashioned, Indiana Jones, action sequence,
Yeah.
you shouldn't look too close at the motorbikes because they were obviously not that period, because they just couldn't do what we asked them to do, but well disguised, and you don't even think about that stuff when you're watching such an exciting action sequence. And yeah, no, that all went pretty smoothly. And it was one of those days where you walk away going, wow, I think we really nailed that.
Oh, I absolutely agree. And I remember the first time I ever watched it, I was blown away by that because, you come off of this, sort of horrific story, and to end with Indy sort of pumping his fist in the air as, he passes the train ever so slightly. It's terrific. But now let's move on to the next episode you worked on, which is Petrograd, 1917. This one's a little bit interesting because it got paired with a different episode and now forms Adventures in the Secret Service. And in all honesty, I must say that particularly your half, is one of my favorite episodes. It's an absolute masterpiece. And, I think what works so well in this episode is, you have this paradox of Indy working at the French embassy, right? But he's simultaneously befriending this group of Bolshevik revolutionaries who are similar in age to him. Why was this idea so compelling to you, and what was your kind of initial vision for this episode when you first read the script?
Probably what fascinated me about it was exactly what you mentioned, the fact that India was, living with these young revolutionaries, and obviously working as a spy. And and he adores these people, and they adore him, but tease him mercilessly about what he does, but they just accept that fact. I thought it was an interesting dichotomy, if you like. Yeah.
Well, let's talk about some of the set design here, because the architecture and the interior design of all these buildings in this episode, it really adds that sense of authenticity that you get in the series. So, like, do you have any behind the scenes details to share about shooting on these locations for this episode?
We were shooting in Prague and St. Petersburg. All the interiors are shot in Prague. Stunning location interiors. Here's a country that was not bombed in World War II, totally preserved. And interestingly, even when the communists moved out, just not long, the revolution was not long before we started filming there. They didn't wreck anything, that some of the Estates Theatre and the National Theatre, they're breathtakingly beautiful. These theatres date back to Mozart's time and beautifully preserved, even by when the communists were there, that they weren't wrecked. And there are so many of these mansions and apartments and things that are just breathtaking. And as an Australian, a lot of these places that we filmed at were sort of older than, before our country was discovered. That was what's so amazing about it. So there was an embarrassment of riches as far as locations and sets were concerned. I did want to also incorporate St. Petersburg, because that beautiful city, although a bit sort of run down, and I remember when my assistant director Crispin Reese and myself went to scout there, we caught a flight from Czechoslovakia on a Sunday afternoon from Prague to St. Petersburg. We were the only two people on the flight. It was right when everything was collapsing in Russia, and we landed in St. Petersburg, and it was bleak and cold and raining. The airline explained to us we wouldn't be going to a gate; that they'd just bring out a ramp, and we'd walk down the stairs, and we'd be picked up and taken to customs. And so Crispin and I are walking down these stairs out of the plane. It's bloody freezing cold and snowing, and these two giant Amazonian soldiers come towards us, and both turned out to be women. And they said, "Mr. Wincer, Mr. Reese, we have a problem with you leaving Russia." And we thought, oh my God, what is going on here? And because their English was not very good, they couldn't really make us understand. They said, "Follow us." So, we went to customs, and it was explained to us that the flight to go out on wouldn't be leaving St. Petersburg. We'd have to go to Moscow and catch a plane out of Moscow to go back to Prague. So we go, oh, sure. And then we met a Russian liaison guy who took us to a hotel, and we had a pretty good scout terrific to tie in some of the exterior scenes, with Prague, so that the whole episode obviously believably takes place in St. Petersburg. And so when we started to film, when we went to Russia to do the Russian part of it was a very cold, wintry Saturday morning, and I'm standing in the giant square opposite the Hermitage Palace at the Triumphal Arch, it's called, I think. And I said, I think we'll put the camera here on the crane and we'll crane up and we'll push through the arch. And this Russian grip said to me, yeah, that's what Fred Skepsy did when he made the Russia House. Now Fred's a good friend of mine, another very successful Australian director, and he'd done the Russia House there. So then we went to our next setup, which was another location called the Griffin Bridge, where these beautiful gold
Oh yeah.
griffins and across the bridge. And I said, we'll build a tower here and we'll shoot down past the griffins. And yeah, that's what Fred Skepsy did, But so the problem with shooting in that part of the world at that time of the year, although we did the St. Petersburg shoot towards the end, I think it was in April, so the daylight hours were longer. But when we were shooting Petrograd, the daylight hours were like, didn't get light before about 9. It was dark by about 3. So every day you'd film exterior daylight scenes, and then you'd either film night scenes or you'd have to go and do an interior because of the lack of daylight. And so quite challenging, but it was it was a fun episode. And one of the locations where Indy's based, where in the basement of the French embassy, is this amazing archives that we shot in, with
Wow.
years and years of paperwork from the communist era, where properties were taken and all that, but they had records of it all. And so the one thing we weren't allowed to do was to touch anything on the shelves, but it was a fantastic location. And the other half of the episode was directed by a good friend of mine, Vic Armstrong, who
Oh yeah.
was, he was originally Harrison Ford's double in the original Indiana Jones, and wonderful stunt coordinator and second unit director. In fact, worked on many, many big movies, and he worked with Mel Gibson and on Braveheart, and George obviously knew him and knew that he was up to directing an episode. And he did that's a beautiful episode, Austria, old-fashioned kind of black and white spy sort of thing of the third man type of thing and all that. Yeah, another example of some of the great people we had.
That's incredible that you mentioned that, because I thought it was a set. I mean, and you definitely see there's one shot, when he comes walking through it, and it's just the amount of it, I think, perfectly represents, Indy working as a translator. So that's terrific.
Was there any like social tension at all when you were, basically you're creating an episode about the Russian Revolution during the fall of the Soviet Union?
No, not at all. No. In fact, when we were in St. Petersburg, we had escorts everywhere. We had police escort. It was absolutely fantastic. And when it came to lunch, because there was no such thing as location catering, Rick McCallum went out and bought everybody's pizzas. And when we came back, the Russian crew was so appreciative, and the police motorbike escorts, they'd literally never had pizza in their life because they couldn't afford it, and they were so grateful. And they probably knew the content of the episode anyway, but nonetheless, we were welcomed with open arms, and our filming for the 2 days there went very, very smoothly.
In some ways, the cinematography in this episode, it matches the other episode that got paired with this one, for the DVD release, which was Austria 1917. And you touched on the places being a little bit run down. Was there a certain artistic look you were trying to achieve in this episode?
I suppose after my scout of St. Petersburg, I changed my idea about some of the architecture from Prague and stuff, but hopefully pretty believable, I think. Just wasn't possible to film a whole episode in Russia, so we just did what we could there. We also had a wonderful actor called Roger Sloman, and I said to Dave Tattersall, let's make this look like a rock concert, and he did a great job, with heavy backlight on Lennon, and Roger did a beautiful job. He literally just flew in the day before and knew his speech perfectly, and it just nailed it. He was great. The very way that he was able to deliver his speech really fired up the crowd and all the extras, and so it was great.
Yeah, and there's so many great scenes in this episode, I think, and we'll touch on Lennon again, I think, because that's a fantastic one. But one of the first ones that I love is the scene at this tavern that's called the Dancing Bear,
No, the
and
bear pit.
yeah, the bear pit. And one of the great aspects of this episode that I really felt was compelling, and there's fantastic dialogue here too, is the relationship that Indy has with his fellow companions. You can tell they all enjoy each other's company, and how did you instruct these actors to create this authentic sense of camaraderie? Because they're also positioned within such a worn torn locale.
Um, the way I work is that in television, of course, you just don't get the rehearsal time you need. For example, when you have a bit more of a luxury schedule, like on a movie schedule. So I tend to meet every actor beforehand, tell how I see the character, and then I listen to their take, and we always arrive at something that we're both comfortable with, so there are no surprises on the day. And the way I work on the day is that I will just have all the cast on the set and no crew at all. We'll block the scene out and rehearse it, and then I will, give notes. And the reason I do it that way is that if you're rehearsing on set with the crew there, the actors tend to quite often play up to the crew, particularly if there's a funny line or something in it, and that quite often sends them off in the totally wrong direction. So I tend to keep rehearsals pretty private until we're ready to shoot, and then and that's how we sort of arrive at relationships, by saying, no, I don't think that character would do that here. I think what Indy would say is this, or da da da, and that's pretty much the way I structure my working day with the cast and the crew.
Wow, that's an absolutely great, philosophy and sort of way of doing it. And I'm glad you mentioned that because I think that kind of sheds some light on why this episode is so successful in that way. So that's terrific. And, that really comes across to me in this. We talked a little bit about it earlier with the locations, this Bridges of St. Petersburg sequence. And, I think it works so well because we have this character, Rosa, who obviously has some feelings for Indy, but, it's kind of a nice contrast to see such a wholesome love story like this, even though they don't really feel the same way about each other in the end. And, I just love the beautiful aesthetic of Petrograd, even the music and, the shots of both of them together and, coming together during this sort of difficult time. And, I'm curious, during emotive scenes like this, how important are visual cues for you in addition to written dialogue?
Obviously, it's all about the way a scene is shot, and the temptation on television is close up, close up, close up, close up, two shot sort of thing, but George wanted us to give it more a movie look, and in the way you stage scenes. And so I suppose a lot of it comes out of that. It's always hard because I do action sequences, storyboard, because there are so many pieces, and they're shot all over the place. But the scene, for example, with Indy and Rose, it's all about simplicity, and is it? I think it's Rosa. That's right. And she was a lovely little actress, actually from Austria, I think. Basically, kept it very, very simple, and once you've rehearsed and they're comfortable, quite often when they're still struggling a bit for words in a scene like that, it actually helps the scene because it gives it a reality.
I love the way you sort of instilled fellowship and good spirit in these characters during the hardships of war. And there's a really great scene here where they decide to cut Indy's cake, and it of course sparks this whole philosophical discussion about different types of government hierarchies. What was the purpose of that specific scene, and what were you looking for in it?
Well, that's really was on paper. That's all Gavin Scott, who wrote this script, and I think it was a terrific scene because dividing up the big piece of bread into pieces gave, I think, pretty easy understanding of how it all worked. I suppose it was a simple way of illustrating it, but that was very much scripted.
Let's come back to Lennon because you were talking about you really wanted to shoot it like a rock concert, and I think I've got to say you really did that really well. It captures that sense of feeling, the grandeur and the force of his speech and communism and how it's affecting the crowd, and their response is infectious. It really pours over Indy in the scene. So what took place, behind the scenes to put this large crowd together, and how did you work with the actor, who played Lennon to effectively convey the forceful personality of this historical figure?
Roger had done this character once before, and I'd seen a flash of it, and I thought, geez, this guy's good. And I think he was suggested by casting lady Lucy Bolting. Um, So I knew that if he gave it full tilt, and there was no chance of him being, what I call the 412, over the top. The problem with the crowd, of course, is they didn't understand a word of bloody English.
Oh
They're all so
yeah.
everything is done through interpreters. So I standing up on the stage, and the interpreter who's standing off slightly out of camera line, but in their eye line, would wave when they should react in a big way, and so that's what it's like working with 400 or 500 extras who don't speak a word of English. And again, a lot gets down to the way the scene is edited and cut and all that sort of stuff. So again, Larry Rosenthal did a beautiful score, which is terrific, and so yeah, that's sort of how you go about it.
Right. And during this final scene here, of course, Indy attempts to stop Irina and Sergei from protesting. And I love the cinematography here because it kind of shows Indy physically and metaphorically getting overrun by the power of the revolution as he tries to stop them. And, throughout this episode, Indy was given very clear directions that he must work with the utmost diligence to avoid letting the Bolsheviks come to power. And, I think it kind of calls into question the loyalty he has with his friends. And I'm curious, what do you think is important about the theme of friendship in this episode, and what effect does it have on character development in filmmaking?
Well, Indy cares enough about his friends to save their lives despite what he's been asked to do. He knows at this stage it's just not going to work, and having to do it in daytime, and so I just went for the sort of epic, if you like, with the huge crowd of marchers led by Indy's close friends, and intercut with him. And Rosa, running down the back alleyways of St. Petersburg to try and warn them that there were guns lying in wait, and I think that certainly captures Indy's anxious feelings, because at first he was sitting in an armchair in their apartment, and Rosa comes in, and Indy decides, oh bugger it, I'm not going to do anything about it. But then his conscience gets the better of him, and off he goes. I suppose that's what's good about this series, is that you see Indy in all these extraordinary situations, and how it questions his beliefs, and challenges everything that he stands for, and I suppose that's what's exciting about the series.
Oh, that's a terrific point. I think that's a really, really good way to put the show in perspective because that's what I love about it the most. And I think Sean Patrick Flannery did a very convincing job playing sort of the innocence a little bit of Indy at this age, and also learning so much through these experiences. I mean, the situations that George came up with these historical events, it was just brilliant. And one final thought I have here is, this episode, ironically enough, kind of reminds me a little bit of the Schweitzer story because he too is conflicted with two things in that episode: his duty as a soldier, and here, of course, his duty, to the French embassy. But then he also learns about reverence for life, which we could sort of parallel with the relationship he has with his friends. Would you agree with that statement?
Absolutely, totally agree. Yep, absolutely.
Oh, wonderful. Well, thanks for creating this episode because I think out of these four that you did, it's my personal favorite. So it's absolutely fantastic.
Yeah, look, it's interesting because it's quite different from all the others, and that's why I enjoyed doing it. Because I went, in terms of shooting, I went from doing Oganga into this one. I did next before I did Trenches of Hell, and the Light Horse one. I did this episode, so it was a nice contrast. Just going back to Trenches of Hell for a minute, there's a scene in the Great Escape episode where Indian is made of they're being marched through a town, and then it comes under attack, and they're racing through the streets, and that was a town about 2 hours from Prague, but it was being demolished because it was totally polluted.
Wow.
And I can't remember what they mined there, but it smelled. It was a very heavy smell of sulfur in the air, and most of us, we had the choice of staying there in an adjacent town overnight, or driving all the way back to Prague with our drivers, and most of us chose to do that. Ironically, we were able to bomb the shit out of that place. Pardon my French, but because it was being demolished, and so it's so real, those scenes where there's bombs going off and buildings blowing up, and I forgot that was. I remember that was in Czechoslovakia, and to be able to do something like that as a filmmaker is fantastic. Oh, you can You can blow that up, put a bomb anywhere you want to. It was great, So sorry, I digress, but I'd forgotten to mention that when we were talking about that episode.
Yeah, I love the realism that all these episodes have. I feel like it's something that we're kind of lacking now in modern television, and it's just really cool to see it here.
Well, let's dive into the next episode you worked on, which was Palestine 1917, now known as Daredevils of the Desert. And interestingly, this was one of the few episodes that didn't get paired together or already wasn't a two-part story, like, for example, Trenches of Hell, because this episode aired as a 45-minute episode originally. But then for the DVD release, it was extended with new footage that you shot, deleted scenes, and also some sequences from your own film, The Light Horseman, to create this 90-minute movie. What were the major differences between each version of this? Because the original one went unaired in the US after the show unfortunately got canceled.
It was a 45-minute episode and was pretty action-packed. And when it was expanded to 90 minutes, there are a few ouch moments in there because it is very heavily padded. I think I wasn't available to do a lot of the additional scenes because I must have been on another movie or something. But there are a few, for me, little ouch moments in there. But nonetheless, the spirit of it is still great. Literally my first day meeting George Lucas, and we sat down to lunch on location in Africa, and there was this gap in the list of episodes that said October 1917, and that's when I mentioned my film The Light Horseman said The Charge of Beersheba, October the 31st, 1917, and George wrote in his list of scripts, Palestine 1917 and The Charge of Beersheba, and he said, "Oh, talk to Frank Darabont and see if he can write the screenplay," and so that's how it came about.
And I can imagine that it was probably rather a unique circumstance to sort of be like reconfiguring a television episode that, had already been made. How did you try to differentiate this episode or do something similar after already creating The Light Horseman, which was already about the same topic of the Battle of Beersheba?
Yeah, I suppose and my film was a 120-minute film, and Indy, obviously, there had to be a lot of compromises. Look, the characters are quite different, the situations are quite different. So from that point of view, the only thing I knew was that having to recreate the charge with a few clips from my film, the Light Horseman, and Ben Burt, who cut this episode, did a brilliant job again. Just what a darling man and what a great talent he is, and both sound and editing wise. He did an amazing job. And the biggest irony for me was when we were recreating, putting our indie characters into the charge, we had Turkish horsemen playing Australian light horsemen, which was a great
Oh,
irony
really?
because obviously that's who they were fighting against in World War One.
Right.
And there's one particular moment, one of the characters gets, shot in the charge, and my assistant director, Bob, we're on this location that vaguely resembles the Beersheba landscape, and he was driving the tracking vehicle because there was no one else to do it. And we had this actor sitting in the back who basically supposedly takes a bullet hit and then just falls out of frame, safely into the utility, and you cut to the wide shot where he comes off his horse, so forth. And I'm saying to Bob, he's driving this train, and he goes, go faster, go faster. He said, I can't go faster. All these horses are galloping past us, this
Right.
poor little old Turkish youth just couldn't cope with. But anyway, one interesting thing happened with the episode in the original one that I shot. Maya, played by Catherine Zeta-Jones, she actually got up into where the wiring for the wells was, and she was about to pull the plug when Indy comes in and shoots her.
Wow.
Anyway, when we showed George the episode, he kept saying, "Oh, it doesn't feel right. The ending, it doesn't feel right." And we both agreed it was a bit low key. It just didn't. Okay, she was the baddie. She was the double agent, and beautiful as she was, she got shot. Anyway, George said, "What about doing a sock fest? An old-fashioned fight between Indy and Daniel Craig, a John Wayne type best Western sort of punch-up,
Wow.
And we said, yeah, it's a great idea. So anyway, Simon Crane, Ben came up with a few clips from old movies and stuff with ideas for stunts and stuff. And Simon Crane choreographed this wonderful bloody fight sequence. And ironically, we shot it in Prague, of all places, because the rest of the Light Horse was made in Turkey. So we shot this great fight scene between Daniel Craig and Sean, and a real sock fest, bang, bang, crashing through doors and smashing chairs and da-da-da. And George was right. It really worked terrific. And it was a great end to that episode. A really, really juicy, beefy, old-fashioned sock fest, as George called it.
That's amazing. I love that. I love that scene. I think we'll talk about it a little bit later too. But I know you mentioned this a little bit earlier. Lawrence of Arabia was a big inspiration of yours and your filmmaking style and everything. So I guess how did it feel to direct the same character in the context of Indiana Jones?
There's a glimpse of him only in my film, The Light Horseman, this guy in flowing white robes in the distance when he drops off his character called Meinerzager. But Dougie Henschel, who played Lawrence, he'd actually been in an earlier episode with Young Indy. Can't remember which episode that was. I think it might have been Egypt or something like that. He'd been introduced as the character. He's a lovely actor who it's gone on to great success. He's had his own series. Lovely Scottish actor. Yeah, I suppose Peter O'Toole's performance in Lawrence is so extraordinary and so wonderful. It's a pretty hard act to follow, but in Dougie's defence, I think he did a lovely job. He's a very interesting character.
Yeah, I recently watched that film. I was really in awe with the sense of scale and everything. Like when you see those landscapes, those are actually there. In movies today, those are probably would be all computer generated, but I love that sense of realism. And I think you do such a good job of continuing that sense of realism in this series.
Yeah, and the cinematography of all these battle sequences is extremely well done in this episode. And, in particular, one of my favorite shots is this scene when the Australian light horsemen take charge in Beersheba, and it cuts back and forth between the artillery wheels and the horses running. And I just have to say, I get the sense you have a really strong understanding of how to shoot horses in this episode. And, did a lot of your prior work on Westerns sort of translate to this episode here?
Yeah, look, I suppose I should tell you, I've been around horses since I was a little boy. 4 years old, I think I learned to ride, and I was a polo player and all that sort of stuff. So I still ride, and so I've been around horses pretty much all my life. We actually live on a horse farm just outside Melbourne, and yeah, so obviously know what they can and can't do, and also how to shoot them, and always work with great people. The wrangler on that episode, Jorge Cazares, and honestly, he was brilliant. Um, we had to use horses that were all obviously local and owned by different tribes who all hated each other. And but anyway, he pulled off some remarkable work and stunts, and in particular when a horse, Daniel Craig, is behind a machine gun, keeping Indy, from breaking away cover, and this horse, Daniel stands up to take his leave, and this horse comes crashing over the machine gun post and barrels Daniel to the ground, and the horse goes down, and Jorge did that stunt. It was just amazing. No rehearsal, no. He said, "Oh, I can do that. We'll just lay this horse down and da 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 da." He and his team, as a Spaniard, were just fantastic. Having people like that, he knew that I knew horses and what they couldn't do, and he knew that I knew where to put the camera to capture it and so forth. And yeah, so that's what it's all about, really, to me. And being able to revisit that sequence was sort of difficult, but on the other hand, it was rewarding.
The scene with Colonel Meinerzagen, and his idea to launch what he calls a flim flam, to trick the Turks into thinking they will continue their attack on Gaza, creates a really intriguing plot for Indy as a secret agent because again, going back to what we've been talking about, he sort of gets thrust into this situation and has to kind of figure things out for himself and comes in contact with so many different historical figures along the way. And particularly in this episode, it deals with this idea of espionage. And what do you think is important, when it comes to espionage about, separating our knowledge as an audience from what's really happening within the diegetic world?
It's an interesting question. Look, I can tell you that particular sequence had been done in my film The Light Horseman, slightly differently, but basically Minus Hagen in The Light Horseman was played by a wonderful English actor called Anthony Andrews. And Anthony was a great horseman, but he played Minus Hagen in my movie and basically goes out, supposedly bird watching, knowing that he's going to plant this haversack, and he actually nicks his horse's neck and gets blood on the haversack while he's supposedly stopped for a bit of lunch while this light horseman is standing guard, and then they take off and he drops the haversack. The light horseman goes to retrieve it and he says, leave it. And then they gallop off to safety. And we did a variation on that, I suppose, on Young Indy, where Indy goes back to try and grab the haversack and he's told to leave it. The haversack actually contained a letter written by an Australian nurse that Meinert Hagen had convinced her to write, a love letter to her husband saying that she missed him and she missed the baby and all that sort of stuff. The idea of the handwritten letter was to convince the Germans, because there was this very personal letter. A man would never part with a letter like that. And actually happened in history. And my colleague who wrote The Light Horseman discovered the letter in a museum in Beersheba in Israel. And
Wow.
it's not even mentioned in Meinert Hagen's diaries, because the theory is that Meinert Hagen actually had an affair with this nurse. But anyway, it's an interesting world, espionage and spying and all that sort of stuff, and always fun to portray it on screen.
Yeah, because when I watched The Light Horseman to be ready for this, and I was wondering if that was like an actual historical fact or if it was more of a reference to your other film. But yeah, that's really cool to hear that story from there.
Yeah, no, it's actually, that's a true story. It actually happened. Yeah, that's how they fell for the ruse, apparently.
Right, and I think it creates this dueling tension between Colonel Eastman Bay and then of course Schiller, who was assigned to be sort of the head of espionage at Beersheba, and it really adds this compelling dynamic to me, to kind of portray his overconfidence. Right, he thinks he's right the whole time, and in this episode, to me, one thing I love is that the villains to me seem so real and they're so compelling. And are there any specific characteristics you think are important for great villains in a film?
No, not really. I mean, you don't want them curling their moustache or anything like that. The big villain in this film is Catherine Zeta-Jones. The interesting story how we cast Catherine, because we'd originally cast Minnie Driver to play the role of Maya. And Minnie rang me while I was still in London casting, and she said, "Oh, Simon, look, I'd love to do this. It's really wonderful. It's a lovely role, but I've been offered 3 months in a BBC television drama, and it's so much more work, and it's such a small fee on Indy compared to 3 months work." And I said, "Well, look, take it. We'll find somebody else." And so I went off to Istanbul, and then the casting lady rang me and said, "Look, we've come up with a few names, and here are some videos, and take a look and see what you like." And there was a couple of other girls, and then there was Catherine. And whatever this movie was, I don't know what it was, but she was literally naked for the entire movie. I think probably Michael Douglas has bought every copy of that movie because no one can find it. But anyway, so she was very good too. But anyway, it was naked Catherine, and so she replaced who had originally cast Minnie Driver. And when Catherine arrived in Istanbul for the shoot in the bar of the hotel, and waiting for her to arrive, because she arrived about 11 at night, and she came in the bar, and gorgeous looking lady, and I said to her, "Look, I hardly know you because I've just seen you in this movie where you didn't have any clothes on." She laughed. She thought that was very funny, and anyway, when we did our first day's filming with Catherine, it was when she holds up Indy, who's sending a carrier pigeon away with the message, and Catherine was in jodhpurs and boots and a jacket and looking gorgeous. And I got a note from George after he'd seen the dailies saying of all the Indiana Jones episodes and films, she was the closest to an Indiana Jones woman, and which was a great sort of compliment, I think. And anyway, she also Catherine had to do this belly dance, which she learned to do from the Turkish belly dance. And of course, when she did it, freezing cold night in a castle in a place called Chesme, somewhere down on the Mediterranean, south of a place called Izmir. And she just brought the cast and crew to a standstill because it was just so stunning. She'd learnt the moves, sexy and exactly what was needed. And I thought she made a great villain.
Yeah, I totally see like her as a very much an indie character. I can see the comparison you could make between her and Elsa in Last Crusade. So that's really cool.
Yeah, well, one last final question for Daredevils here. We touched on Catherine Zeta-Jones. What was it like working with Daniel Craig?
Oh, great. No, he just turned up and did actually very easy to work with. And God, we had appalling weather. We were filming, we started in Istanbul where they'd finished the episode that Mike Newell did.
Oh
And,
yeah.
and then we had, in the meantime, we took a whole nother unit south, because that whole dropping the haversack and all that was pretty complicated, but very simple camera wise to shoot. So we shot that while they were still finished. The main unit was still finished in Istanbul. Anything with horses and galloping and actors, and it all takes time, you know. So that wonderful Turkish actor, his name was Haluk Bilginer. He's played Ismet Bey, you know, and Ismet Bey went on to become Prime Minister of Turkey. He was a wonderful actor, spoke beautiful English, and the scene in Ismet Bey's office, which was where Daniel Craig brings a prisoner in and says, you know, he's a spy and da da da, and then Indy pulls this thing with a knife and convinced Bey that everyone's lying. And anyway, that is very much Frank Darabont invented all that. So not how it actually happened, but anyway, it was good. It was good fun, and because we had to involve Indy in it, obviously, and there was no way that Indiana Jones was saving the worlds of Beersheba as the charge came in. But it was a great story, and the point of the episode was meeting the characters within the episode rather than how much was the dead truth. But I'd say 90% of that whole episode, it's certainly true, and the weather was just, we had some really bad weather in Turkey. And there was one day where the location, the interior was literally an old barn, which the art department miraculously turned into this office. But it was in the middle of nowhere, and but it was all we could find. And it snowed and snowed and snowed. And so there was literally snow coming through the roof between takes, you know, and people clearing the snow and stuff like it was. But that's filming in Turkey, and in fact, Catherine's entrance on the camel being led in by Marnitzagen. And one thing people mightn't know is that horses hate camels. The camels have a smell about them, you know. Anyway, the bloody camel was swaying all over the place, and Catherine saying, "Wincer, will you get me off this effing camel?" She was absolutely lovely and a real pro. And but the other thing was, it started to snow. They're all shoveling snow off the desert sand to make it look like the desert, but it was literally freezing, you know. So there were all those kind of challenges, you know. But that's filmmaking, I suppose, in a way. And we certainly had a share of it on Young Indy. But you know, always good fun. And there was one day when Rick said, "Look, take the crew, get in your vehicles and go south and find a beach somewhere. And maybe you can just do Catherine getting off, you know, off the camel or something like that." And we drove everywhere and we set up in one place and it started to snow and da da da. And in the end, I sent everybody home and rang Rick and said, "This is the first time in my life I've never been able to get one shot in a single day's filming." But he was really good about it, understood. But yeah, sometimes days like that happen, and it's very rare that you don't have weather cover. But in this case, because of, you know, we're in Turkey and trying to make this barn into a presentable sort of place for Ismet Bey's office, it just wasn't ready, you know.
Yeah, and it's, fabulous that, you had these actors and actresses like Catherine Zeta-Jones and Daniel Craig. I mean, such great stars. And, you even had, in other episodes, perhaps you may know, like people like Christopher Lee and Vanessa Redgrave, and the talent that came to the show was unbelievable. And, when the show did get canceled, unfortunately, of course, you had just finished Palestine around that time. But as you sort of mentioned earlier, George Lucas, he had this extensive timeline of almost 70 stories that were going to be developed into full-length episodes going all the way up into the feature films. Was there any indication you would return for season 3? And if so, were scripts written for those episodes, or were you aware that they were potentially doing more?
No, look, that was pretty much it for me, because I remember when I went to Prague to film that end fight scene with Daniel Craig, which replaced the Catherine Zeta-Jones Mayer shooting. I literally flew there for 2 days to do that. Yeah, I think probably, it may have been more successful as it is now, these 2 hour movies, which I think are all stunning.
Yeah, well, I'm so glad that this show got released on DVD because it was so lost for so long, for a while now, and it's such a shame that it got canceled by ABC in 1993, and never really received the critical acclaim that it did. But I think one of the reasons we started this podcast is to promote this show and understand that it was supposed to be different than the films, and I think you captured that really well. As we sort of wrap up, talking about these 4 episodes, are there any other specific behind the scenes stories that you'd like to share with us and all our listeners that are particularly memorable?
Well, it all goes back to the script, and honestly, the scripts that I got to do from Frank Darabont and Jonathan Hensley and Gavin Scott were just lovely, So that's such a great starting point. And of course, it also attracts talent. If something's well written, then it's going to appeal to really good actors. And so in that regard, as they say, it all starts from the very top. And you had George and people like, David Barron and Rick too was a great leader. He was very gregarious, and as you go down the list, it's an amazing sort of group of people. The privilege of doing something that Spielberg's name is attached to as well. A privilege to be a part of it, and working with such great writers. And it's all about story and script, and that's where it starts. And to me, that was the strength of the series.
Well, that's terrific, and it's great to hear that you got so recognized by George Lucas and Steven Spielberg, and rightly so. I mean, I think a lot of our listeners would agree that some of your episodes are the best in the series, and it's just terrific to see the attention to detail and the quality and the collaboration and how many people were involved in this show and went on to do great things. And George Lucas and Rick McCallum, they had a great eye for spotting talent, and I think you deliver this very well in this show. So congratulations. That's terrific. And speaking of, you talked about Spielberg, who actually wasn't regularly involved in the show. Did you meet him at all, or was he involved in the production?
Oh yeah, yeah. Met him a number of times, and I was at my girlfriend's now wife's apartment in Santa Monica in Los Angeles. And one morning, not long after I'd done the African episode, the phone went and Liz answered and said, "It's Steven Spielberg on the phone."
Oh my
Oh,
gosh.
Oh my
and
goodness.
he was in Prague about to start. Not Prague. He was in Poland anyway, about to start his first day shooting on Schindler's List, and he wanted to talk to me about a film that his company Amler was making called Small Soldiers, and I think his sister Anne had written the first draft, and I said, "Oh, why me?" And he said, "Well, I've seen your battle scenes. You really know how to do battle scenes. You understand geography, so you know where everybody is." And he said, I really admire your work. And then he loved the stuff I'd done with that character Bartholomew and the little boy.
That's amazing.
So I was quite flattered. Anyway, I did work with Anne a bit on the script, but I think I then became unavailable. That was my Spielberg story. And then of course I did Into the West miniseries on history of the American West, basically. I shot the first episode, which was the second one in the series, called Manifest Destiny. It was a sort of wagon train journey across America, but he just wanted the same thing like Young Indy, this sort of epic sort of look. And it was a terrific episode, which I loved doing. And he was at the time doing War of the Worlds, and we were both night shooting. We were in Calgary and he was somewhere on the East Coast, and I'd get a phone call, between setups, and it's Spielberg giving me notes about my rushes, how he liked this and didn't like that, and da da da. That's life in the movie business.
Well, let's talk about this holistically now. As you reminisce about the Young Indiana Jones Chronicles, I guess 30 years later, what did you take away from the experience, and what impact has the show had on you, as a filmmaker and as a person, I guess?
Well, first and foremost, I think working with George Lucas, I took away a lot. I learned an enormous amount. A level of respect for him as a storyteller, knowing how important story and character is to him as opposed to technically good. But no, he said, no, 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 it's all about story and character. And of course, his sage advice, knowing when to compromise and when not to compromise.
Yeah, absolutely. And, Mr. Wincer, it was our privilege to have you here on the Indiana Jones Universe podcast today. Thank you so much for joining us. This has been absolutely terrific to get to hear your own behind the scenes stories and contributions to this series, which we love and adore so much. So this has been terrific. Thank you so much for this.
That's a pleasure. Look, it's been great talking to you, both Will and Elijah, and hopefully you'll have a great response to your podcast. I look forward to hearing about it.
Thank you. So that about ends today's episode. Thank you all so much for joining us. If this is your first time listening and you enjoyed this episode, please consider subscribing to our podcast and telling other people about the show. You can also visit our website at www.theindianajonesuniverse.com and follow us on Twitter at the Indie Universe for more podcast news. So thanks again for joining us, guys, and we'll be back soon with another episode.
Once again, I'm Elijah.
And I'm Will.
And I'm Simon Wincer. And until next time, so long, Dr. Jones.